Hey everyone, welcome to this talk on the philosophy of Ray Peat. There's two reasons that I'm recording this talk. The first one is that, like many people, I was drawn to the work of Ray Peat for the dietary, nutritional, and sort of very practical advice regarding personal energy. I found it to be, fantastic, and it's worked very well for me. The methodology of Ray Peat has worked very well for me with regards to nutrition and diet. But as I read more and more of Peat's work, especially his two books, Generative Energy and Mind and Tissue, I found, well, here is Peat, mostly known as a thyroid specialist, a physiologist, and a nutritionist. Here is Peat referencing Edmund Husserl or William Blake or René Descartes. Here is a philosophy, a holistic philosophy. And I found that very peculiar, and I read and I took a lot of notes and did a lot of research. And, at a point, as many of you know, I wanted to interview Peat specifically about the philosophy of his work, away from the technical discussions, which he, that was more of what Peat did, was having these technical discussions regarding people's personal dietary issues or energy or nutritional issues, and these are the kind of style of interview that you'll find online. So I emailed Ray, and he did get back to me, but unfortunately, he wasn't well at the time, so we couldn't have the interview. And this was a couple of months ago. And as many of you will now know, recently, just a week ago, Ray Peat passed away, just a few days ago. So I took all the notes that I made largely on generative energy and mind and tissue, because this is where you find much more of the structured philosophical material. And I've attempted to turn these into basically a basic sort of introduction to the philosophy of Ray Peat talk. And so those are the two reasons that I'm doing it. It's because it was planned, and there is a philosophy here which I think is hopeful, full of vitality, full of energy, and is just extremely intriguing. And so moving forward, I'm going to have to keep moving my camera around a little bit for this talk. There is like this one quote which is to be kept in mind at all times when thinking of Ray Peat's work, when thinking of Peatism, or Peating as it's commonly known online, which is energy and structure are interconnected at every level. Energy and structure are interconnected at every level. And really, in a way, okay, energy and structure is extremely important in that quote, but every level. Because a westernized scientist might take that quote and go, well, you're talking about every level, but of course, if you're talking about energy, then you're only talking about the human being. If you're talking about nutrition or diet, then you must only be talking about the human being and the levels in the human being, or something like that. No. Every level for Peat. This is a radical philosophy, a radical holistic philosophy. For those that don't know about Ray Peat, he had a PhD in biology with a specialization in physiology. He wrote his dissertation on the work of William Blake. He was also a thyroid specialist, and from this has grown this sort of Ray Peat or Peating culture around a methodology of self-healing, self-regulation, almost like a physiological personal liberty, and a perception which is really re-owning the fact that it's your health, and that it's only from your own personal context and your own personal perceptions and actions can you begin to investigate what it is to build up energy in your own system within your own sort of context and holistic context. And I think it's great that there's this breadth of complexity alongside structure to Peat's work. But if you look on his site, he says simple things such as, I offer some practical methods for solving health problems by increasing biological energy. Or, I offer some suggestions on the way our inner world can mesh with the outer world in such an energy-based orientation. And already there you see little hints of the philosophy that I'm going to be talking about in terms of inner and outer world. We're talking about mind-body split. We're talking about mind and matter. Or as Peat wrote in his title there, mind and tissue. What is this this is the big question. What has this separation done for the way that westernized medicine thinks about itself and thinks about how to heal, thinks about how to address dietary, nutritional, energy problems? These are problems of energy and structure. And he says he wants to shift the theoretical focus in the study of self-ordering processes away from the informational, statistical, toward the energetic, to interpret structure, phase, and state in terms of energy and history before considering their abstract informational properties. This is a natural, inquisitive, or you could say organic investigation into a reliance by yourself on your own health, okay, self-healing, self-regulation, and it's to perceive your own context in a holistic manner. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are you eating? What do you do for work? What's your exercise regime like? Are you near, what are your pollutants that are around you? And context is constantly moving. Alongside this, there is an ideological component that we'll get to. But the big questions are how, in the sense of philosophy, the big questions are to do with wholeness, as in parts or wholes, the questions of how do we address our health? Is it parts or wholes? And the other questions are to do with actually ideological questions to do with determinism and helplessness. These are the big parts for a Peatist methodology, a Peat methodology. And it's always important to remember that it's a methodology. It's an investigation. Dare I say it's even an adventure into self-healing, serious self-healing, because there is not a Peat diet that I'm going to promote here. There is no Ray Peat diet, because as soon as you have a diet, what you've done is you've boxed something off and you're beginning then to average out everyone else. You have to then sculpt down each individual to fit the box, as opposed to an individual should be imbuing out an excess in the sense that they're learning and growing energetically and vitally. Okay. And actually, in terms of this major question of wholeness or holism, we begin with the first chapter of generative energy, which is called Aspects of Wholeness. And ultimately, the reason I've put the painting there by William Blake is that, of course, Peat wrote his thesis on the work of William Blake. But what we find in Blake's work, what we find in the way the brushstrokes are, in this vitality and vibrancy of Blake, is excess, is energy, is an unapologetic energy, an excess of being, and there's nothing wrong with that. And this foundational sociological discussion regarding what is the dialogues around energy, around structure, around vitality that are ongoing in your immediate contextual culture. What are they telling you about how your health should be, or what you should do about your own health? Okay. And so we find in Peat something very anathema in terms of the way Western medicine, Western science, Western nutrition, Western diet approaches things. It approaches things in this sense of like not a positive healing, but like a cure. Like you're ill, you're tired, you're drudging around. It doesn't actually approach it psychologically or sociologically speaking from a foundation of, no, we can be energetic. There can be this Blakean excess of consciousness. This is a possibility. And this is a huge theme for Peat, an appreciation of the unexpected and of spontaneity. And what is the unexpected and what is spontaneity in terms of structure? It's an excess of energy which is overcoming an inertia. Okay, I mean, and that's, you look at this is simply called Europe, this Peat, the Ancient of Days, and this is an overcoming of inertia. This is a vision of a holistic vitality, because Peat has to sort of disconnect himself from our culture, which is energyless. It lacks vitality, and so when we think back to that sort of or alpha Peat quote, energy and structure are interconnected at every level. Well, what's the energy and structure of society? When we think about them being interconnected at every single level, well, society at the moment, Western society at the moment, we live in a society, Western society at the moment, what is it? It's structureless, it's nihilistic, it's anti-life, it's antinatalist, it's inert, it's entropic. People are just on a very slow slope down to nothing. Everyone has the same conversations. The media is getting simpler. The things that we are fed are getting simpler. The food is full of absolute crap. And in this sense, in the sense of a junk, entropic, nihilistic culture, then of course no structure can be built because the culture is energyless. And so this reciprocal relationship between energy and structure, what can come from a culture which is energyless? No structure. It lacks vitality. And so this holistic, holism philosophy is the observation, says Peat, that although natural objects can be resolved into their parts, the parts are to some extent shaped by their participation in the whole object. So in the sense that you could take this individual from their nihilistic culture and you could say, right, now we have this part, okay, and then you try heal them up in the sense of an energy abundance. Well, in the sense that their context is completely, quote unquote, rooted in an energyless and therefore structureless culture, a big part of their individuality and that reciprocal relationship between the subject and the object in that manner is built from a nihilistic culture. So a part of it is going to be that culture. Energy and structure are interconnected on every single level. And so a big facet, a big part of westernized medicine in this nihilistic anti-life culture is that, well, they don't want to deal with the holistic problems. They don't want to deal with the whole because it's too much to deal with that context. And so you begin to reduce things into parts. You say, well, you just have this problem, and if we just solve that, you'd be fine. But it's useless because things aren't parts. Parts intermingle. There is no point where you can draw a line and you just say, right, we just deal with that. Okay, in the sense of maybe you have a broken bone. Well, there is going to be a dietary influence on that, and there is also going to be, to a certain degree, a psychological and holistic social elements to that. We see this a lot around the culture of COVID, which has become a culture of illness. Everyone is talking about their illness all the time. Everyone is talking about the possibility and the mortality is this negative energy of mortality and illness around. That is ultimately an element towards self-healing as well. So when we move to the specific philosophy of, holistic philosophy in general, these aspects of wholeness or wholeness in general, which is really what Peat is focusing on, in the combination of parts, in their communication, their physical intermingling, there is for Peat to be an emphasis on the arising of this spontaneity, this excess, this harmony. Nothing can arise from this tendency to try just build this one little part up, because the part is intermingled and communicating with the whole. And it's in that sense you begin to reduce things down to statistics. Once again, you average everything out, and then you begin to just look at averages of parts, and there's no longer this excess. And so Peat says, holism, or a non-dogmatic attitude toward the world, recognizes individual uniqueness rather than averages, and is likely to look for complex causes, especially environmental influences, rather than too easily ascribing traits to the genes. And so we have a lot in there, right? But the big discussion to begin here, to really open up this philosophy, and well, how does this holistic philosophy connect with the practical elements of like nutrition, diet, and these things? Well, we have a little key there on page 4 from Generative Energy to the genes. And here's the big thing for Peat: genetics and genes, the language around them, genes themselves, and the talk around genetics, inherently ideological. Western medicine likes to pretend that it's pure. It's pure of ideology. It likes to pretend it's pure of ideology and that it doesn't have any hegemony, that it's pure science, that there's never been any emotional things or any other context come into it, because it adheres to its own ignorance of holistic, of the reality that we're not just parts, okay? And so in that sense that it's ideological, what's the ideology that's coming from genes and genetics, which we are pushed so much? What is the ideology? Ask yourself this: what is the ideology of genetics and genes? It's biological, physiological, and dietary determinism. It's dietary helplessness. Well, that's genetically what you've got, and so there's your bag, there's your lot in life. You can't build more energy. You can't grow more because genetically you are locked in. You think about the language that surrounds genetics, says Peat. He says, he talks about, when we talk about genes, what are we talking about? We're talking about programming. We're talking about controlling. We're talking about governing. Okay, and so everything is already locked in from this. But what what? You say, well, what's the alternative? What's been missed out? What's the ignorance at play here? And Pete says, consciousness, perception, sensation, pleasure, and intention have often been omitted from the world described by reductionists. And when he talks of reductionists, he's primarily talking about people who want to go, it's just genes, reduced. The problem's been reduced to the part of genes. We no longer need to worry about it. That's your lot in life. You can't grow energy. You're helpless. Move on. That's reduction, because what else have you got? Consciousness, perception, sensation, pleasure, intention. Okay, and really, Pete, in a way, much like the writer Irving Babbitt, is taking the scientific positivists, the scientific extreme materialists of like, unless it's statistical data which we can exactly quantify down, then we don't care about your experience. But consciousness, perception, sensation, etc., these are all elements of experience, and so they absolutely have to be factored into the holistic philosophy of health, growth, and energy. So, and in focusing on these parts, or one part being the genes, reducing, you remove life from life. Consciousness, perception, pleasure, sensation, intention. That is what it means to be alive. That isn't the biological processes of, oh, well, you're this amount of this, X, Y, and Z. You've removed the liveliest aspects from life. Okay, how can you remove consciousness and perception from dietary and nutritional, practical physiological philosophies, and somehow only make them secondary to material symptoms and cures? Immediately, what you're doing in that sense is you're partitioning everything into parts, and you're removing yourself from the holistic reality which is right in front of you. And so when we think back to that first, energy and structure are interconnected on every level. The relation of energy to structure is the central question of biology, the central question of physiology. How are things being built? Once again, you can think of that negative culture that we have. But Pete says on page 5, when energy flows through matter, order accumulates. That's fantastic right there. When energy flows through matter, order accumulates as a result of resonance and hysteresis, for example. But we hear so much about entropy, randomness, and symmetry that we forget most of the formative processes in the material world. We don't think about formation anymore. We don't think about growth. We don't think about energy, entropy, randomness, chaos. These are the buzzwords of Western medical science, which wish to simply just abstain from that. It's genetically reduced to that. Forget it. You're 50. Those things happen now. No. This is a dietary, physiological philosophy which is holistic and hopeful, and it's pro-life in the sense of pro-living, pro-vitality. We don't see much of that anymore. Now, when we move more specifically through to genetics, biology, and energy, I've titled this little section here. As I said, genes, the notion of genes is inherently ideological because it contains the notion of a unit of continuity and therefore continues the dogmatics without question. Well, if it's genes, it's genes, it's genes, it's genes, okay? You have entered a hegemony without realizing you've entered a hegemony, and we can no longer question it because it's governed, it's controlled, it's programmed, okay? So the ongoing discussions now always go, well, genetics, and we need to think back right to that beginning, energy, structure, and excess, an overcoming of this supposed inertia that we've just been deterministically given. And a great way to really open up how expansively Pete thinks about these things is this quote. The literature of dissent, I wrote my master's thesis on William Blake, always reveals an abundance or excess of energy. I came to see literary periods or styles, classical, realist, romantic, surrealist, etc., as reflections of a society's energy and structure. And I would ask us all to think back then on what I said earlier about, okay, well, if literary or even artistic periods are reflections of society's energy and structure, with energy and structure being interconnected at every level, energy flowing through matter and organizing something, what can we make of our society, our period or style, with writers such as Houellebecq or all this nihilistic thought? There is no energy. It's an energyless society, and Pete is here with the Peatian methodology to re-imbue the vitalism. And so this relationship, taken from Blake, okay, between the social reflection, this relationship influenced Pete's understanding of physiology, energy, and the brain. Okay, so it's a perception that one's attitude towards authority, which is part a part of the whole of the holism, had a correlation to their body and the nature of their consciousness, and thus, arguably, one's propensity to self-heal is in relation to their internal dissension, their internal anti-authoritarian, non-dogmatic nature. Okay, because, well, if you enter into a dogmatism of the medicinal and a dogmatics of diets and nutrition, here's the problem, once again, that I mentioned right at the beginning. There isn't a Ray Peat diet. There isn't a Peat diet. That has to be emphasized because, well, you have a diet. What's a diet? A diet is a dogma. And the individual, you can think about the individual walking through a diet as a thresher, because now all these contexts of the individual, they're ripped away. It's dogmatics. And so there is a relationship between the mental energy of creativity, investigation, intrigue, dissent, and quite literally physiological longevity. And so in this sense, Peat turns to non-dogmatic science and reads mainstream science and psychology non-dogmatically to unfold these problems of how do we begin basically to heal again in this culture. So I don't want to go into huge technical things in this talk because it's primarily about the philosophy. But in terms of these non-dogmatic tenets, you can think of some basic tenets at this juncture as high body temperature in terms of longevity and structure, oxygen absorption, and these are often related to thyroid problems and hormone imbalances. But if you want to look into the techniques or technicals of the diets and the nutrition and what to do, the work of Danny Roddy is great, the Ray Peat Forum is great, but Ray's articles are fantastic, of course. So, I mean, we now begin to get into sort of murkier waters of what can an excess look like? How can we begin to think about excess vitality and energy? And Pete has this strange quote about where he says, if we can generalize from animal studies, delaying puberty could increase brain size and longevity, improve intelligence, decrease violence, and even make people physically more attractive. I think this will be the next step in human evolution, just as nurturing, stimulation, and freedom promote improvement in the function and structure of the brain, cruelty and oppression act in the opposite direction. If puberty is delayed, then the importance of a culture which supports curiosity, exploration, play and sensuous pleasure seems obvious, so that biology and culture will be mutually supportive. And I think the reason I have included that quote is because I think on a metaphorical level, it really does articulate what is happening at a wider perception in Peat's methodology, in the sense of an expansion, a potentiality, a possibility. And we see this in this even more peculiar quote. When old rats were grafted onto young rats, the old member of the pair lived twice the expected age. That is, old tissue seems to become younger on young animals, and young tissue can be aged by association with an old animal. There is this merging. There is this expansion of energy and material. And these things overlap. There is an interlapping and I've completely forgot the word, but there's an overlapping, a crisscrossing, a molding. There isn't. Once again, we go back to holistic philosophy, the basic tenets of a holistic philosophy, which is to say, these aren't simply parts. You think about the grafted young rats onto the old rats. There isn't this. If it was simply parts, you just have these two parts, and what would happen? Quite nothing. There is a merging. There is an imbuing, and what needs to happen then is the energy excess culture needs to imbue and expand outwards. Now, what is really the importance of this when we look at energy and evolution is, for Peat, this evolutionary excess of energy was one of the determining factors in the origin of higher types of animals. It's the origin of growth, the origin of organization. Once again, the excess of this sort of the evolutionary excess of overcoming inertia in terms of energy was really what determined the move from sea to land. Energy excessive transitions were achieved via a high metabolic rate. So this is where the technicals come into the philosophy. When the energy excessive beings kept their bodies at a steady, fairly high temperature. This is when higher types of animals, the transition into the higher types of animals began. And when we look at our history now for peat, in the continuation of history, the consumption of low energy foods, such as foods high in unsaturated fats and seed oils, lower the metabolic rate, creating a form of toxic oxidation. They harm the respiratory and circulatory and immune systems. They increase the rate of aging and cancer. And philosophically speaking, they lower the available energy excess we saw as the determining factor in literal evolutionary growth. Energy, structure, evolution, growth, coming back to energy, that energy excess. Basically, you can actually put this in an oddly simple way for Peat, where he says, the choice of foods which have less unsaturated fats tend to reinforce the achievements of evolution. And that is where the philosophy and the physiology, you could say, completely entwine. And it actually follows for Peat, and this is in generative energy, that an increase in the Earth's temperature will lead to prolongation of youth and the development of better brains, and such a world won't be controlled by the seed oil industry. Equally, further disruption to this energy generative approach to life and food is caused by heavy pollutants such as lead, sulfuric acid, and other heavy metals. Now, as we move through much more to more emphatically of the theoretical and philosophical ideas of Peat, we move through to one of the more important areas of the philosophy, which is a critical attitude regarding the Cartesian notion of existence, whereby ordering happens from the outside with respect to materials, and such materials are thereby devoid of secondary qualities, qualities which are other than being present in space, are like many of the billiard ball examples given by philosophers. And when we think of Cartesian, the philosophy of René Descartes, we often think of I think, therefore I am, but we also often think of what became to be a very robotic, dualistic mind-matter split, which I believe for Peat did a lot of harm. And so what Peat says is an old idea in our culture, which still inclines many people to a billiard ball conception of mechanistic causality, is that matter must be ordered from outside. For Descartes, this involved a material world which lacks secondary qualities, i.e., every quality other than being present in space. That abstract world was supplemented by an utterly separate world of mind and spirit. Descartes' spirit has continued to live in many geneticists who see selection as an ordering principle imposed upon a stupid sort of material substance which can vary only randomly by chance. This mind-matter split arbitrarily creates this secondary selective geneticist ideological realm which we have no control over, in the sense of the billiard ball causality. It's like the one ball hits the other and there is something else which causes it. It's this vague deterministic region we have no control over, and this in itself completely removes, once again, all those secondary qualities in terms of the human of consciousness, perception, intentionality, which we spoke about before. And so this form of causality seeps even into the medical establishment, basically under the guise, once again, of the ideological factor of everything's blamed on genes. Everything's blamed on some deterministic outside, quote unquote, outside factor, despite clear evidence of secondary factors such as environmental factors, unsaturated fats, etc. Peat is drawing modern science into a discussion with its own tenets, which it's begun to ignore. And Peat leans on a primarily physics-based approach to biology, where the holistic view of biology opens itself to utilizing physics and chemistry to understand itself outside of the Cartesian split lock-in. Okay, there isn't this split and then a deterministic factor where, well, sucks to be you sort of thing. When you begin to re-enter into the holistic philosophy of drawing in all those elements, the personal elements which I spoke about before, then you finally begin to enter into a world of possibility, potential, energy, again, overcoming the inertia of that stupid deterministic factor. So, in this way, a holistic view of biology is open to using physics and chemistry as well as ecology, history, cosmology to understand, to achieve an adequate understanding. And Pete does mention that there is a weird sort of quantum physics world which is now coming about, and actually is probably basically beginning to slowly open itself to the ideas put forward here. However, there is an extremely important quote on page 23 of Generative Energy, which I think is of the utmost importance of understanding how this holistic, of a way of understanding how we can begin to think about the holistic philosophy of Ray Peat in relation to whole over parts. And he says on page 23, Einstein observed that an object's fields amounted to an extension of its material substance. Einstein observed that an object's fields amounted to an extension of its material substance, i.e., he preferred to materialize fields rather than to dematerialize things, as some of the popular philosophers of physics would do. And so many other types of research in absorption fields and long-range order made it clear that the interaction of atoms and molecules in cells needn't be governed by either direct contact or by random motions. Basically, when cell components are rearranged, they return to their normal position in relation to other components, revealing a great capacity for self-assembly or self-ordering in relation to one, that fields theory of Einstein, in the sense there's an extension of the material substance, but the reordering from the not just direct contact and not from random motion, but from, once again, that holistic expansion and then a self-assembly or self-ordering. Structures often accommodate themselves to the surrounding conditions, and this is, in a way, good or bad, because psychologically speaking, socially speaking, the accommodation of structures in relation on the cellular level, moving through to the personal level, the social level, and then actually the cosmological level, the accommodation of things to their structure is ultimately, we'll get through to this with Pavlov, a peculiar flip of what can happen, whether or not you're going to overcome the inertia. It's like, in what sense are you going to accommodate yourself? Are you going to accommodate in entropy, downwards, or are you going to accommodate in the excess? Okay, so the accommodation to the pollutions of the time, to screen time, how much are you looking at the screen? How often are you eating junk food? Are you giving yourself over to entropy? Is the accommodation and the learned helplessness, which comes from the ideological basis of that genetic westernized medicinal talk, which I've already mentioned. And so it basically becomes this feedback loop or a reciprocal relationship between the energy ingested into the body and thereby the brain, and the complexity of the structure developed by the body and the brain, and even to the extent of when we think of food in this sense, and I don't think it's too far to say this, when we think of food in this sense, Pete himself painted and had a holistic philosophy of life, we could say. When we think of the food we're taking into the body, of course, it's the energy we're taking into the body, but also, are we living in an industrial setting? Are we watching crap Netflix documentaries? Are we constantly challenging ourselves towards that excess of both being and energy? If not, then the reciprocal relationship is ultimately going to be that the energy ingested is going to enter into an inertia. Or if it's the other way, in the sense that you're constantly overcoming the inertia of whatever it might be with an energy excess, then the complexity of the organism begins to develop and you begin to self-heal. And so an organism's ability to cope successfully with its environment becomes dependent on its relative level of complexity and energy. And also you throw in the factor of don't give in to learned helplessness, usually with the environment succeeding. The environment often succeeds its entropic demands on the individual. So it's almost like a courageous task of the individual. And so Pete says, in therapy and everyday living, we can try and protect and promote our energy-producing and energy-using systems by seeking the stimulation, the conditions of light and temperature, and the foods that are appropriate for our evolutionary level. Okay, once again, you go back through to the basics of a higher metabolic rate and a better process of oxidation. You move away from foods of high and unsaturated fats and PUFAs. You need to be eating the foods, as Pete says, appropriate for your evolutionary level. Once again, I'm not going to comment too much on the technicalities here. So, life in evolutionary terms begins as a respiratory system, which for Pete moves into the light. Systems evolving to protect respiration from ammonia, cyanide, and carbon monoxide would be the first systems to make use of light. And the study of this, origin of light is used by Pete to begin an understanding of the basic biological rhythms of life. Now, expanding out from these works, expanding out from this basics of biological systems, which began as respiratory systems and thereby moved into the light because they wanted to move away from ammonia and cyanide, thereby bringing about the basic biological rhythms of life. We expand out into the works of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and more specifically V.I. Vernadsky, who I've put a little image there. And it's from the study of these processes in relation to light, respiration, heat, and second-order field effects of material objects, as I mentioned in that organizational ability of the fields to expand, that humanity will find its place. This is the growth of humanity. And our current understanding with respect to industrialization is still very Cartesian, in that we split between industry, pollutants, and nature, and then we split between ourselves. Okay, so they're things over there and we're things over here. Like, if we could just get rid of pollution, or if we could just deal with that part. It's like there isn't parts. It's a holism. It's a philosophy. It's a holistic philosophy. It's a philosophy of wholeness. You cannot simply cut off one part and just deal with that on its own. Because one, as you're dealing with it, the part's going to change in relation to the context of everything else. It has to be a philosophy of wholeness, as I've said. And so Vernadsky is someone that Pete draws on a lot in generative energy. He was a scientist within the Soviet Union who proposed in his theories of biogeochemistry that the migration of chemical elements tends towards a maximum. The migration of chemical elements tends towards a maximum, and that human culture and consciousness participate in these natural relationships and processes. This is in terms of the difference between Soviet understandings of really energy and how things are being built and organized compared to contemporary westernized notions. Is westernized, and Pete says in the books that German and Anglo-American science at the time was idealizing randomness. And once again, not only randomness, but chaos. And then also, well, you just have genetics and that's what you got to deal with. Thinkers like Vernadsky pushed against the idea that nature was ruled by randomness. He promoted ideas of lawfulness, limits, harmony within natural fields. Ultimately, his thought leads towards the idea of a stability. And from a stability can be built a complexity, and from that order, and we can go back to energy and structure are interconnected. Energy, stability, complexity, structure, order. And so in such a natural system of equilibrium, the biosphere is driven by energy from the sun, light and heat, building order. This isn't simply some random thing. Basically, nature is not ruled by accident. There is structure. And Pete says once that principle is accepted, that nature isn't ruled by accident, and if once that principle is accepted, nature is not ruled by accident, and if life is seen as part of nature, then Vernadsky's second law, that evolution will produce species which maximize the migration of chemical elements, follows naturally. That is to say, evolutionary excess, energetic evolution, vitality. Fixed laws apply, and chance does not exist. And this movement of structure and energy, which we now see as like a trajectory, energy moves into the system, which is based on the biological processes, which were built from the very basics of moving into light and protecting respiration and heat, light, respiration. Well, what's going on in the human body? Higher metabolic rate, higher internal temperature, and also higher rate of oxidation and absorption. Moving along this trajectory of energy into stability, into a complexity, and into structure and order is exactly the same trajectory. And so In an experiment in 1971 involving acids, peroxides, iodine, and copper, Peat found the mixture changing color in an oscillating reaction. Such a reaction involves the dimension of time, generates spiral structures in space, and the theory that basically comes from this, which is extrapolated a bit more in generative energy, is that if energy can do something, if energy can do anything, if energy can do something, it builds structure and complexity unless retarded by another factor. And we are constantly thwarted, both by other people in terms of, well, this is all you can do. This is the only healing that's possible. Don't worry about it. Energy will build structure, and it just doesn't need to. It shouldn't be thwarted by other factors. Spontaneous creation is due to unhindered energy supply. And such an unhindered energy supply in relation to theories of abundance or stress predetermines the evolutionary future of man. And so Peat on page 39 says, when food is abundant during pregnancy and when the environment is not stressful, the brain of the fetus grows at a faster rate than in cases in which the pregnancy is affected by malnutrition or stress. Since the brain is a metabolically expensive organ, and since your larger brain tends to correspond to a higher metabolic rate of the entire organism, it appears that the developing fetus is anticipating a lifetime of relative abundance of food when it is well nourished in the uterus and when it is exposed to less cortisol and more progesterone. We have the excess, which comes through to energy, which then goes back through to what actually happens on a sociological level. Energy and structure are interconnected at every level of that juvenile or adolescent mentality of investigation, of adventure, of excess, of energy, of vitality. These things follow from one another, and then you end up with this natural Peatian investigative methodology. And so this strange little quote, the infant represents our evolutionary future because the infant is infinitely open and expansive and with a positive, adventurous naivety in a way, an innocence towards the world, which hasn't given itself over to inertia. It hasn't given itself over to a part. Oh, well, the answer is this part. It hasn't given itself over to genetics. The infant represents our evolutionary future. The energy excesses of this great birth and joy represents the evolutionary future. Which brings us through to really what's going on in the medical sphere and a lot more of the ideological content of the book. So to begin this, Peat says on page 43, the idea that the patient is a self-healing, self-organizing kind of being is unpopular with the medical business because they have no investment in the providing of healthful environments, clean air, clean water, clean food, safe work, good housing. And we can think about this actually. The contemporary medical business doesn't care about health because you go there and you get a part cured. You have one problem, one ailment, and you lob a pill in for that ailment, and then you go back out into the polluted, fluoride-filled, seed oil-filled world, and you're cured because the part is finished. It's holistic. Health comes from the holism. And so what you can see actually from this, though, to draw in the philosophy, is that the contemporary reductionist philosophy of medicine, once again, reductionist in relation to that helplessness, the contemporary reductionist philosophy of medicine adheres to the Cartesian split, mind-matter. Like there's just this one thing outside that you go in, you deal with, and it's in this weird deterministic sphere. And it ignores field theory. It ignores that merging that's definitely happening on the cellular level, on all levels. Energy and structure are interconnected. Therein, what really happens in this reductionist sphere is that each defect or problem or ailment is assigned a sort of singular form of cure, as opposed to building up a holistic form of health. And reductionists are so fundamental as they don't even address their methodology because their method is already determined by that strange Cartesian sphere that was mentioned. And actually what's happening there is you're entering into a form of faith. And Peat says, if the trick that explains the whole can be found in the nature of the parts, there is no problem. But problems arise when the reductionists claim that we already have the kind of knowledge of the parts that can adequately explain the whole 45. Basically, reductionists cure parts as isolated from any sense of the whole, which is why most people never get better again, because, well, ultimately, if you cure some random part with a drug and then they go home and eat a ton of junk food and eat a load of unsaturated fats and seed oils, then no, the cure isn't there. So the stability within the systems and the stability of the whole, this interconnectedness needs to be focused on in terms of self-healing. The stability which we saw with Vernadsky's work is found in the Peatian sense, interconnected at all levels of energy and structure. You have a stability with interstellar space, subatomic particles, petroleum, etc. So basically there are rules of stability which pertain to general levels of complexity, and for Peat this means that there is an ontological or a link of consciousness at all levels of existence, atoms, human health, the cosmos. Energy and structure are linked at all levels. So Peat says systems in which energy, guiding or driving energy, is added and given off at every point. Systems in which no part is in equilibrium. This is how the world is, but it's usually omitted from scientific descriptions because of its complexity. In dealing with complexity, in dealing with the whole, you're dealing with... People don't want to have to deal with non-equilibriums, which ultimately become parts, and they become these false, inert places, because there is just a constant flux of energy and flow, and things and contexts and everything changes with respect to that. And so Peat seeks to move this generative, energetic view, which we now hopefully roughly understand in relation to intermingling of fields, how energy builds up in terms of organization. And he wants to move this now to a societal level by way of stating that we should shift the qualitative development rather than the quantitative. When it's moved through to a societal level, Peat wants us to move through to a qualitative development rather than a quantitative extraction and production. And so a qualitative development in relation to the whole, as opposed to, once again, that statistical informational emphasis on the quantitative, which averages things out. And via this mode of qualitative of economizing, the imagination of man is expanded, which for Peat is actually the area which holds the vital impulse of man, and in turn increases possibility. So in the sense there's an energy excess, we need to recalculate what we think of as energy, because in the sense of the imagination, there has to be an excess of the energy of the imagination as well, in terms of moving into a potentiality. So Peat opens a section on energy with the quote, "Energy is the only life and is from the body. Energy is eternal delight. Energy in an importance," and that's from William Blake, and then he says energy in an important sense is prior to information, especially in the context of biology. And so the role and focus on energy is starting to gain acceptance. It's starting to be taken seriously. The focus for health and life holistically, it's about the preservation of qualitative energy. Energy supplies to a system cause it to be self-regulating, whereas a failure of energy can produce self-defeating shock states. So we need to be moving towards that energy excess. And the most beautiful quote from Peat is on page 112. "Being alive is good for you, but our culture is saturated with arguments to the contrary, that it is life which kills us and self-denial which sustains us. It is always easier to blame the victim than to search for the real cause of a problem." And this is like the sociological and personal basis of the beginning of a Peatian methodology of moving towards how can you increase your metabolic rate? How can you increase oxygen absorption? How can you increase energy within the personal system as to increase structure, create stabilities, increase structure, and therefore have order? And so this idea of overcoming inertia, of finding this excess of energy, Peat turns to painters. And he says, "Several years ago, I was thinking about the different levels of ability among famous painters of history. And I read about the family origins of some of them. The painters that I considered to have the best ability turned out to have come from poor families in which skill in a craft was accepted as the way to earn a living. The bad but famous painters had noble origins, in which there was no tradition of skilled work. Painters who were insiders, familiar with the attitudes of the rich who paid for the pictures, knew what things would flatter, what things were fashionable, and what would contribute to prestige. The people from a lower class, however, had to be very skilled at painting if they were to succeed. And I think this illustrates something general about truth. A person's vitality is drawn forward by meaningful work. That is, we grow to meet the demands of an important opportunity. And you notice there that in the noble origins of painters, the ones that Peat considered bad, they were already in a social and energetic inertia regarding their artwork. The way to overcome it was this, well, it was an overcoming. It was a vital overcoming of having to learn, having to investigate. And so the pages from in Generative Energy from 70 to 110, because there's a big leap there, I understand, are very, very technical and less philosophical. You'll see that if you go to read it. And ultimately now, we move through. So we have this foundation, basically, of energy and structure are interconnected at every level. There is this Field's theory of intermingling and self-organizing bodies on the cellular, social, personal, and even cosmological level. There is this philosophy of holistic philosophy that the whole, you can't reduce things to the parts. And there is a critique of reduction, of the reductionists, of genetics, of learned helplessness, and this peculiar Cartesian determinism. From this, I move through to what I think is probably my favorite book by Peat and favorite writing, Mind and Tissue, Russian Research Perspectives on the Human Brain. What's the overview of this book? Peat is seeking to broaden perspectives of science, which he understands truly as humanism in a very true sense, in a very human. What I mean by that is the notion of humanism has sort of been tainted a bit by contemporary humanists. Peat is seeking to broaden the perspectives of science in the face of modern professionalism and constraints, and he seeks to defend it as properly humanistic in that old sense, which is why that needs to be emphasized. So, in the spirit of matter, Peat begins with a culture as a theory of human nature. Some cultures are self-deprecating, others are split in their image of a noble class ruling an inferior class. And it begins, the title actually, right at the beginning, is Historical Origins of Russian Brain Theory. So Peat is looking at the Soviets and he's looking at the Russians because ultimately they offer us such a radically alternative view than the West and what has happened in the West. They offer us potentiality, they offer us a teleology, they offer us a point, and they offer us openness to the fact that energy can be imbued once again. And he begins by emphasizing the difference between Greek and Roman understandings of Christianity, peculiar enough, which for Peat is respectively a difference between knowledge and power. So Greek knowledge, Roman power, and how these two specific understandings can constrain human nature. Now, the important point for understanding some of the present cultural differences between Russia and the West is that Russia has for centuries felt the influence of Aristotle, and for Peat has not suffered from the influence of Plato or Calvin. And obviously with both Plato or Calvin, I would understand it there that Plato in the sense that he's giving over just something above, and Calvin, once again, with the double predestination, is you're entering into that Cartesian determined billiard ball causality thing where it's like, well, there's this hover sphere, we just give it over to that. The reduction of the of those who abide by genes, once again. It does beg to say, I don't know too much biographically about Peat's personal beliefs. I would assume that I would put him in the camp of like a vitalist. I don't see sympathies for God. Someone might be able to correct me on that, but I see him really in the vein of vitalists. So growth and change, and thus an understanding of energy, of course, for Peat, are important for Aristotle. And so with the Russians, and this is why he's turning to Russian brain theory, is that you have the foundation of Aristotle. They're influenced by Aristotle, who has, for Peat, and this is Peat's reading, growth. And then, of course, then, growth and energy. For Aristotle, growth and evolution are both a process of realizing the thing's nature, whatever the thing may be, which is already present as a potential at the beginning of development. So when we think of Peat, we need to think Peat, potential, possibility, growth. Okay, and in Soviet scientific literature, which is the main focus of Mind and Tissue, inheritance. Here we go, and this is the important bit. And this is where it gets radical. In Soviet scientific literature, inheritance of differences in mental ability is denied. You don't have that genetic, deterministic outside thing. Deficiencies aren't justified. Energy is put into altering the holistic environments which may be making that problem occur. And Peat says on page 26, since Christians use the idea of purpose or teleology to deny materialistic explanations of evolution, most materialists have been extremely careful to keep anything resembling a vital impulse or a teleological force out of their theories of development and evolution. If time, history, and dialectical development are to be affirmed, they have felt any tendency of matter to favour a certain line of development must be denied, because it would let preformationism and dualism get a foot in the door. And so we're moving over to, once again, a possibility of growth. And Aristotle held that matter was not passive in this sense, that given the necessary conditions of life, it realizes its potential and takes its form neither from the environment nor from chance variation. And so Peat, bringing in other thinkers, says, Eimer held that orthogenesis, straight-line evolution, could result from a moulding influence of the environment, and Lamarck emphasized an active physiological adaptation of the organism to its environment. Darwin would fall into this group to the extent that he denied that variation was random, and also to the extent that he believed that natural selection was not the only mechanism of evolution. We're trying to imbue ourselves with a completely different culture than westernized medicine has given us. We're trying to imbue ourselves with a culture which is ultimately hopeful, because there isn't these deterministic, fundamentalist, dogmatic lock-ins. And Peat has a focus on questions surrounding evolutionary teleology, regarding possible alterations to the environment, whether everything is locked in, and the Soviet attitudes to these questions. And the way he begins this is he turns to a Soviet idea, a key Soviet idea called the dominant, which is found throughout Soviet scientific literature. And within the dominant contains the ideas of focus and perspective, which are regarding and related to what is the physiological basis of organization regarding the world and our place in it. Once again, when what Pete was talking about much earlier in generative energy, regarding the removal of those liveliest and most vital aspects of life, consciousness, perception, intentionality, the idea of this dominant in the sense of focus and perspective brings us back to, well, let's get back to the physiological basis of this in relation to a centering of the nervous system. What role does any of this actually have in terms of organization and energy for man, in a way? And Pete says here, things have intrinsic meaning because they are syntheses within a world of relationships. In the same way that cortical differentiation enriches our experience, forming a dominant opens the known thing into a richness of possibility, of flexible uses and purposes. So in this way, the dominant, this idea of the dominant in Soviet scientific literature, is in essence a signifier of holism. The act of this focusing and perception, as per the dominant, allows the intrinsic meaning of a thing to be revealed by way of understanding its relationship in syntheses with the relationships that make it up. Okay, it's like a positive function or faculty of wholeness. It's placed within the whole. The dominant opens up potentiality, possibility, and flexibility, growth, back from that Aristotelian thing about what's the place of the thing that is intended to grow with regard to energy. The dominant has this perspective on that. And so the process of the dominant is the physiological in relation to thought, as we've seen, is the subject, the process of the dominant is the subject's window into the world regarding that synthetic relationship of the whole, but equally with that teleology of the meaning of overcoming inertia, of an excess. And Pete begins then with this peculiar, well, not peculiar for us, Soviet-based focus on environmental factors in his studies of the mind and our place in the world. Peculiar because they don't really attend to a clear dualism of nature or nurture, and I don't necessarily think within the works that I researched and studied for this that Pete's all that interested in what in the nature-nurture split, what would be considered nature, because, well, you've got that. Why allow that to determine things? We move away from that clear dualism towards that Einsteinian material fields theory. In that synthesis as the perception from the dominant, bringing in the Einsteinian fields theory of merging, intermingling, differing contexts, all connecting in their relationships, moving away from a dualism in their connection to nutrition. Like this merging, very beautiful, overlapping, intermingling process of energy and organization, which then allows us to attend to different contexts. And Peat's attitude towards nurture is dialectical. The organism is understood as being open to an intention of direction inherent in itself, from this perception that it's brought about by the idea of the dominant, the window into the world, as opposed to a Skinnerian view of simply smooth running forward predeterminism, as per B.F. Skinner and the behaviorists. So this idea actually, Peat links to intentionality, right? So intentionality of phenomenology, in fact. So the intentionality of phenomenology is the idea that consciousness is always conscious of something. And from this consciousness in relation to the dominant and the window into the world, this phenomenological intentionality is, in a sense, growing and learning about this holistic whole, but specifically in relation to the physiology when we're talking about Peat's work. So the Soviet dominant, in its potentiality, moves us away from the highly westernized, Skinnerite, behaviorist, predetermined, geneticist determinism into a realm of nurtured and environmental potential and possibility, as opposed to sucks to be you, that's your lot in life. This is a philosophy that's so hopeful. Overcoming inertia, excess, it's truly beautiful. And one odd thing that's drawn in later on actually about the phenomenologists is that Peat says the surrealists are, in a sense, better phenomenologists than even Husserl, because Husserl was about bracketing and purifying experience. And in their intentionality, what the surrealists for Peat are really doing, and people like maybe William Blake are doing, is actually drawing in the liveliest aspects, once again, perception, pleasure, etc., and building their intentionality in their experience from their true experience. Okay? And so, a long quote here from 38. Another way of considering reflection, which we're talking about there in this intentionality, this window into the world of the dominant. Another way of considering reflection is that every organism exists in interaction with its environment, so that a certain kind of environment is assumed by an organism at a certain stage of evolution. The environment, in a sense, is a completion of the organism's structure, since the organism can't exist in isolation, and is selectively sensitive to the appropriate aspects of its environment, such as food and threat. We have evolved a complexity that allows us to select a complex kind of environment to which we respond, and our existence depends on the objective interactions between ourselves and our environment. Our consciousness is interaction, that's phenomenological intentionality. It is a condition for action, but is derived from our activity in the world. To say that it is objective in this way is not to deny the possibility of mistakes and perversions, but it is to claim that in every human idea, perception, or theory, there is some truth, something worthwhile, if we are able to extract it. And that intentionality then, that dominant, once again, that window into the world, leads us into that idea of the Peatian methodology, investigation, perceiving what the problem is. And so, when we're looking out into this world, the idea of ideology comes back in, because what are we giving ourselves over to? And the socialist and Soviet scientists for Peat saw everything as having some social or ideological connection or overtone, thus interpreting their work not just in the larger historical framework, but also in lieu of Peat's idea of a philosophy of holism. Everything is included, and you can't avoid the ideology which might be foundational, and you may be ignorant of it. The Soviet mindset is against isolated motivations, and this relates back to that intentionality and synthetic appreciation of the world as inherently meaningful. Okay, the energy energy in the sense that it's flowing through matter and building structure means structure, something structured. Structures are being built. This isn't chaos. This isn't randomness. And this focus on the intentionality, and therefore motivation, an appreciation of the world, and a building of structure, and this move specifically using the Soviets, actually allows Pete to really point out the hastily occluded ideological basis of Western science. Skinner and behaviorism is really great at bolstering the Western framework of being. The difference in this sense then between the westernized and the Russian models is the sense that behaviors which are emitted in the Western model are predefined by the hardwiring or genetic programs or the motor programs inherent in the human. And the Russian model would still understand typical behaviors as not independent of environmental factors, and that there is no such thing as a pure motor system. And this takes us really back to fragmentation, parts, which is Western, and a unified holistic theories of wholeness, Russian. In the sense that someone such as, B.F. Skinner is adhering to that deterministic outside thing in the Cartesian framework and just selecting certain parts. Pete says, page 43 to 44, the organism then has a model or image of the space in which it will act, of its body's relation to this space, and of its intended behavior or its goal. It is this intention image which very clearly distinguishes the Soviet approach from the ordinary reflex theory in England and the US. And this moving from the dominant to the image is a fairly abstract term, but the Soviet view of the function of the mental image in perception resembles some of the interpretations of Gestalt psychology, but the approach is fundamentally Mandan in emphasizing the objectivity of the image. The Soviet theorist often emphasizes that we can always escape from old perceptual habits and mistaken hypothesis by having new experiences, once again that energy excess, and that the source of the organizing process is in the object, in its objectness, and not in any formal tendency of the perceptual apparatus itself. We're not hardwired, we're not locked in, it's not determined. There is always this possibility for overcoming the inertia. And this possibility of orientation from the dominant, from the image, from our window into the world with regards to the synthetic relationships which we can see, is a utilization of what Pete would call an orienting reflex. An image is formed, a reflection of what these intermingling fields have in relation to our own environmental familiarity and understood meaning, and it frees us from any determinological lock-ins to overcome inertia in that sense. We see peculiarly in the ideas of perception and focus, really notions, inertia changes to like a familiarity. We see this a lot in the West. People become familiar. We haven't really changed the way we do things medicinally for a long time. We accept the authority, and things become to be assimilated, developed into habits. Now, this is all very reciprocal, and it gets interesting when we get through to Pavlov in a second. But I just want to finish off this idea of Soviet psychology and the image that one has from the contextual, subjective appreciation of the whole. And bring it back down to that practical level of like the social level of what is the structure of society. And Pete says that American behaviorism is a fine ideology for a society that wants to combine authoritarian government with a system of specialized training for specialized jobs, because it claims that finely controlled behavior must be specialized and exist as a constraint on behavior. That notion of behaviorism, once again, we see there that it isn't void of ideology, and that there's outside determinism in the sense that, well, what is the outside Cartesian force that we are adhering to as our structure in the West, as the way in which we go about things? What is the authority that we've given ourselves over to? And maybe what is the energy excess descent that we need to imbue within ourselves to overcome maybe some inertias that we are hidden are hidden from us, that we're ignorant of. And it's in this way, Peat always has this huge emphasis on learning. Learning is the opening into a new skill. It's general. It's a potential. It's an extension into the lived world. And any sense of Cartesian dualism is negated by the expansion of the subject into the world via this orientation, this dominant image that we're talking about in Soviet science, entering them into a holistic relationship between self and world, biology and psychology. And this orientation is always a growth reflex, which is why learning is so important, which is why doubly so, in a way, the self-learning and self-regulation, self-healing of learning yourself about the regulatory and physiological processes of your own body within your own dominant image of the subjective, holistic view that you have is going to spiral things. That's a growth relationship. It assimilates strangeness and excess into a new synthesis. The desire for completeness in the body is like the desire for wholeness in the perceived world. Even in exploration, the object is modified a little, but in eating, the object is more completely assimilated to the body rather than the body to the object. The relationship between the body and the object, we're part, we're in. You can't drag us out. You can't drag anything out. You can't split it off. So, my favorite part, really, because when we think of Pavlov, and I think the Peat's commentary on Pavlov and Pavlovian response in general is really where you see the way his non-dogmatic methodology shines here. I think it's fantastic. So everyone knows about Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell, and if every time you ring the bell, you've put food there, the dog will salivate with the food. But then that means that eventually, when you ring the bell, the dog will salivate without even the food being there. It also means that every time Pavlov hears a bell, he'll think of his dog. He didn't realize that one. But Peat says, in Pavlov's work, the conditional reflex was understood as the stipulated or agreed upon reflex. But this essential point has been almost entirely lost in a false translation. For Pavlov, the world's essential property is that it is full of potential, and that we will know more in the future than we do at present. The centrality of time permeates the tradition of Pavlov. If time is real and the world is the source of knowledge, then science is seen as a basic life function, in which the brain is the organ for knowing the world and maintaining an equilibrium with it. The essential feature of the conditional reflex, as understood by Pavlov, was its temporariness. If it is a recognition of a temporary conjunction of events in the world, intelligence requires that it not persist longer than the condition in the environment does. There was always a possibility to overcome the inertia from the condition response by a dominant view of what's going on in the environment. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. Because behaviorism has made modern psychology a non-holistic science, remote from that physiological, dominant, image-based view. Conditioned reflexes in the West program out, like this internal entropy. We're helpless. We've learned our helplessness, slowing us to the mercy of basically crystallized behaviors, which we're then given vague CBT to deal with. In the original Pavlovian sense, the question was of where the brain is putting its attention, energy, therefore developing the structure to overcome the inertia. And in the westernized reformation of his work, the energy becomes conditioned by the environmental limitations themselves, as opposed to noticing from its own image and dominant, the possibility and potential for liberty and exploration. The exercise, says Peat, of the exploratory reflex seems to make more energy available. As long as the world remains a source of new knowledge, the brain will react to novelty with a continued increase of exploratory energy. There's just this build of exploration. It's just some psychologists have argued that psychological conditioning can be used to brainwash people into accepting an authoritarian system. I think it is important to remember that Pavlov understood the conditional reflex to be an intelligent brain process, which allows the organism to adapt itself to the world, but also allows us to modify the world to suit its needs for freedom, dignity, morality, and mental exploration. Peat takes the most misconstrued, determinist, fundamentalist, dogmatic psychology, which is, the horrible behaviorist lock-in stuff, and turns it on its head into a psychology and a physiology of hope, of overcoming of vitality. And so in that way, the self-world, the mind-body dualism, with that weird determinist thing, leaves both at the mercy of one another without any control of either side. Utilization of the body in communication with the synthesis of relationships as an exploratory tool for investigating life and life processes is key for one's increase in energy. Peat, draws on Wilhelm Reich. He's talking about how people are tense and armored. They've actually developed internally this mind-body split to the point where they're, as Reich would say, and a good intro to Reich is the function of the orgasm, is they become armored. And they've developed this themselves. And so the relationship of tension, relaxation, armoring, catharsis, conditioning, and overcoming are of paramount importance to growth. But beginning that growth process is beginning the process of understanding that you're not helpless. But the Western mindset of competition, which is imbued in everything in the West, doesn't understand tensions as something to be like worked away from or worked with. It wants to dominate. Wants to destroy, and that's what Western medicine always wants to do. It doesn't want to understand. It wants to dominate and destroy, which just retains the armored character. And so this last slide I have is titled "Love," because right near the end of Mind and Tissue, Peat talks about, he says, when an individual enters a group with a loving expectancy, the nature of the group is changed, expanded. The world known by each person is extended. The belief that reality is a closed system goes with the belief that we can advance only by hindering someone else. And so the end of this book ends with this idea of effective person, which draws the individuals into communication with each other in a sense of that dominant, the idea of the dominant, that idea of the image, that idea of the whole. Well, it has to include human beings, and they themselves have, in relation to that Einsteinian fields theory, what's called an effective person. In the feeling of love, our inner body space seems to expand, and we seem to be filled with the other. At the same time, we see the world with the perspective of the other, as if the world were enclosed in the other. If all these things are happening, and energy and structure is interconnected at every level, then that fields theory connects to human beings as well. And so in this sort of group energetics, that you find a slower, deeper form of connection with others, a merging, entering, and overlapping, a empathetic form of physiological phenomenology. And ultimately, difference is potential, says Peat, and the body has its completion in the environment that it chooses or creates to live in. And I think that's something to emphasize at the end is all those little things I've spoken about with determinism, dogmatics, fundamentalism. Step back, enter into the holistic philosophy, the holistic methodology of Ray Peat, and say, is this working for me? Does that give me energy? Is that pushing me over inertia? Are the techniques and things that are given by the westernized medicine business, are they actually helping? What's this environment that they've created or has been created for me? What environments have I chosen? And that is the methodology to go forward. So I hope you've all enjoyed this talk, and I've given you at least some foundational basis for what the philosophy and methodology going into Peat's work is really about. And there's this poem is actually found in Mind and Tissue from William Blake. Thou hast a lap full of seed, and this is a fine country. Why dost thou not cast thy seed and live in it merrily? Shall I cast it on the sand and turn it into fruitful land? For on no other ground can I sow my seed without tearing up some stinking weed. And thank you all for listening or watching. And the best places, I guess, for Peat's philosophy, I'd begin with generative energy, then through to Mind and Tissue, and then from there you just have to search around. For diet stuff, the Ray Peat Forum is pretty mad, but it's good. And of course, the work, the best stuff to begin, I think, for the diet stuff is the work of Danny Roddy. But yeah, thank you all for listening. I'll put as many links as I can in the description below. And here's to Ray. Thanks very much.